Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study. Thank you so very much for joining us. I recognize that you could be doing a lot of things on Shabbat. Shouldn't be, but I know that there are other things you could be doing. And you chose to be with us, so we appreciate you joining us today. We are in a new series where we are working through the Pentateuch, the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We are following a cycle, an annual cycle of readings that originated in Babylon, but we're working through this annual cycle of readings, which generally takes roughly 3-4 chapters of text, maybe a little bit more, and we're going to work through it. And at the end of one calendar year, we will have worked our way through the entirety of the Pentateuch. So we want to say again, thank you for joining us on this journey, and I hope that you don't miss one. I missed one, but I'll go back as my time allows in the next couple of days, maybe even this afternoon. I haven't even had a chance to listen to all of Dr. Tabor's yet, and I know it's fantastic, and I can't wait to listen to that. It is posted. It's on our United Israel website and so forth. But last week, Dr. Tabor taught on Bereshit, on the first reading of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 6 and verse 8. The first reading according to the annual cycle of readings, Bereshit. And I will pick up with the next reading. Now, what I want to tell you is that I have to go back and catch a few things from that first reading because this Babylonian cycle of readings doesn't break things down in any semblance that's associated with the ancient division of the text. It's somewhat arbitrary. I have to be honest with you. There are things that were missed when that cycle of readings was set up. Again, the main purpose of that cycle of readings was to accomplish the reading of the entirety of the 5 books in one calendar year. But they didn't follow the ancient cycle or the structure that we're going to get into a little bit today. So I've got to go back just a little bit and pick up some of those things, but you'll recognize the reason for that as we work through the class today, because I'm going to be talking about Noah, the figure of Noah. Now, I think most people, in fact, many people worldwide know who Noah is. It's one of the favorite stories in the Bible. Even children's books, which don't include every story, is going to have the story of Noah and the ark. So we're going to be talking about that. But I wanted to begin by getting a little bit of information about the structure of the book of Genesis. And I know Dr. Tabor points some of this out. And if you, by the way, I know he talked about it, I talked about it, but the book of Genesis by Dr. James Tabor, a new translation from the Transparent English Bible, I'm going to be using this and referring to this throughout the series, at least for 12 weeks as we work through the book of Genesis, primarily because the translation allows me to show you things that you will not see in another translation. So if you don't have this, you can pick it up on Amazon. It's available in hardcover, in paperback, and it's available in Kindle. So really, there's no reason why you can't get it. So look for it, get your copy. We're going to be working in this text. It's an excellent translation. A new translation from the Transparent English Bible. So the transparency allows you, what it's saying by this description is you're looking at English, yes, but you're seeing through the English to the Hebrew behind it. And you're going to see the reason this is important today as we work through. I'm going to give you some examples that at the end of which you'll be running to Amazon, not running, but you'll be typing to Amazon to get your copy. Okay, the first 2 readings in the book of Bereshit, the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis, as we call it in most English-speaking places, covers a great span of time. When you're talking about Genesis chapter 1 through the 11th chapter of Genesis, you are covering a great deal of time. You're basically dealing with from Adam, or Adam, which is translated as soil creature in the book of Genesis by Dr. Tabor. There's a reason for that translation, although some of you might say, well, I've never heard that before. Adam, right? It's associated with the Adamah, the ground, the groundling almost. So is Adam a name, or is it a description of this person? But the first two sections cover from Adam, the beginnings of the human race, if you will, at least according to the biblical account, through the epic of Noah. And this is a great span of time. Now, as far as the structure of Genesis, this Babylonian annual cycle of readings is quite honestly very late and arbitrary. It blatantly ignores the ancient structure of the book. Now, what do I mean by that? Genesis, for instance, is carried along by a substructure that's quite instructive. And the substructure of which I speak is that it is introduced, sections of this book, this compilation of ancient stories are introduced, these sections are introduced and connected thereby to one another in a series of pieces, if you will, stories within the story. And they begin like this, Ele Toldot. This is the English translation most used. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of the sons of Noah. These are the generations of Shem. And there are 10 of these. There are 10 of these. And if you want these in your note, you can find them at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, chapter 6 and verse 9, chapter 10 and verse 1, chapter 11 and verse 10, chapter 11, verse 27, sort of a short section there. Chapter 25, verse 12. There's another one in chapter 25 at verse 19. Then we have 36, 1, chapter 36, verse 1, chapter 36 and verse 9, and chapter 37 and verse 2. These represent the ancient substructure, the skeletal, the framework for the book of Bereshit. A series of 10 ancient stories which are masterfully woven together in a way that is quite artistic and quite beautiful, and yet most translations failed to draw this out. These are the generations. Tabor translates more literally and more accurately, these are the bringings forth. Toledot. A yeled is a boy, a yalda is a girl. The idea is it's a birthing, the beginning of a new story, a new period of time, and so forth. Because this is the book of beginnings, the book of the beginnings of people, of places and things, necessary knowledge for the rest of biblical literature. In other words, if you don't get it right in Genesis, if your foundation is wrong, everything's off. So we have to get the foundation. We have to know these people. We have to know these places. We have to know key concepts. We're going to meet this week with, in the reading in the book of Noah, or the story, the annual cycle reading called Noah, we'll meet things that we have to know for the rest of our time in the Bible. We only know of covenant beginning with the story of Noah. Now, I know people talk about an Edenic covenant and there's covenant all the way back. That's not true, not biblically, not biblically. Biblically, we only meet with covenant here. So you have to know the story of Noah beyond the wonderful story of the boat and the animals and so forth. Now this parashah that is called Noah in our annual cycle of readings actually contains 5 stories within the main story. And the break is not right. Remember I said it's arbitrary, this Babylonian system. The person who designed it, I talked about that in my introduction, I won't go into it here, was not aware, obviously, of where the proper break should be. Now, if you've listened to the teaching here at United Israel for some time, you recognize this idea of white spaces. And white spaces are very important on understanding the ancient structure of biblical text. But in addition, we have to be very cognizant in the book of Genesis of this underlying structure of Ele Toldot. So, but within this parashah, if we weren't following the annual cycle of readings, but we were following the more ancient cycle instead of the annual, if we were following the triennial, which took 3 to 3.5 years in antiquity to work through, it would take us 5 weeks to go through what I'm going to cover today. So buckle up. We're going to be here for a while. No, we're not going 5 weeks on this. But I'm going to give you a high level. I'm going to talk about some things that most times in the past when I've taught through this that I haven't covered. I'm going to cover things a little bit differently. So John Perry, Baruch, doesn't have an easy job this week. He can't just look at old notes and say, oh, I know where he's going. He's got to pay real close attention this time because it's going to be some different material. But according to the Palestinian cycle, and you know, I'm using Palestinian, some people's neck hair raised up. I'm using the term by which it's called in scholarly and academic circles. In fact, in the Talmud, it talks about that in Babylon they followed an annual cycle of readings, but in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, they followed the Palestinian cycle, which was a 3.5-year cycle. So the material from Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, through the end of chapter 11 at this arbitrary break, we're covering a section that would have been broken into 5 parts according to the 3.5-year cycle of reading. In this cycle of the annual cycle of readings, we're going to basically broadly cover from Noah to Abram, all right? From the introduction to Noah until the introduction to Abram. Now, it's not quite exact, so I have to go back a little bit to pick up the beginning of our introduction of Noah, and I'm going to have to cut it a little bit short because I don't want to get into Abram yet. You see, it's a little bit off. It's like if I were there next to the gentleman in Babylon, I would have said, I wouldn't break it there, Bodden. I'd move it back to here, and he would say, okay, good job. Thank you, Ross. But this section that we're going to talk about today, the purpose of today's class is to introduce us to the epic of Noah. There are 3 main divisions contained within this section of text that I want to focus on. And the first one is introduced, and remember I have to do a little background first, but I want to get us to the point where we're going to talk about Ele Toledot Noah. These are the bringings forth of Noah. And this covers, it goes from chapter 6, verse 9, through the end of chapter 9. And in Ele Toledot Noah, this book within the book, this chapter, it's really like a chapter. There are 10 chapters, really. But this book within the book covers chapter 6, 9 through the end of chapter 9, covers from the call of Noah until his death at the end of chapter 9. Then we get into the second within this section, and that is called Ele Toledot B'nai Noah. These are the bringings forth of the sons of Noah. And this section runs from chapter 10, verse 1 until the 9th verse of chapter 11. And in that section, that ancient chapter that most people don't notice, it covers from basically from the introduction to the nations, you know, the nation list, the descendants of Noah, until their scattering in chapter 11 and verse 9. So you've got one deals with Noah, and then one deals with his sons and how they became the nations of the world. And then the third one is from chapter 11, verse 10 through verse 26, and it's called Ele Toledot Shem. Shem. Because once we have the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japhet, the focus gets narrowed. It gets narrowed. Instead of talking about all the sons of Noah, now we're going to focus on one in particular by the name of Shem. And then my arbitrary break, and the reason I have sort of a little bit of a problem with the way this is broken up is we're still not finished with the Torah portion, as it's called, from the annual cycle of readings. But from chapter 11 and verse 27 all the way to chapter 25, verse 11 is an ancient story within the story. That's a lot of text. It's bigger than most. You know, when you write a book, you should try to make your chapters about the same size. When James Tabor looked at my manuscript the first time, he had me reorganize some material as a big-time author. He knows this. He said, you don't want one chapter with 6 pages, one chapter with 12. You know, make it consistent, you know. So, but this is different. In the ancient world, they didn't have that. So we have a book within the book called Ele Toledot Terach. Who is that? It's a major part of the book of Genesis. It runs from chapter 11, verse 27, all the way to chapter 25 and verse 11. The main character is not even Terach, but it's his son. It's his line. It's the bringings forth of Terach, among whom is one called Avram, or Abram. It's a big section of the book of Genesis. This book goes from the birth of Abram all the way until the death of Abraham. By that point, his name has been changed. You see the order, the beautiful order and artistry of the book of Genesis, and then modern translations and modern commentators and even ancient ones totally miss it. They totally miss it. They don't even recognize the structure. How can you understand contextually if you don't recognize the framework whereby we should be focusing our attention? So we're going to be looking at that. So this parashah ends with the death of Terach, but the story called Ele Toledot Terach has only just begun. For my teaching today, I'm going to be focused primarily on the epic of Noah and his sons. I'm not going to get so much into Shem and Terach, because that comes in my next class. But I want to focus on this wonderful story. When you look at the history, maritime history, there are some seagoing vessels that everyone knows. You think about some of those, the Mayflower. Everyone knows the story of the Mayflower. We know the story of the Santa Maria. We know the story of the Titanic, the Edmund Fitzgerald. Think of the ships and the vessels that you know from history. You know, none of these has ever attained the celebrity status of the Ark. The Ark is beyond anything in comparison in terms of the most popular. Its universal aspects, the story has been echoed through the ages. Now, once we get to Shem, in our Genesis story, things begin to focus on a singular family. But at this point in our story, it's universal. The implications are global. Everything deals with everybody. The story is universal in its outlook. Now, at the close, so we have to go back. We want to go back and pick up the beginnings of our Noah story. At the close of the antediluvian age, in other words, the age that existed prior to the flood. When you talk about the biblical narrative and you say the flood, it's everybody knows what you're talking about. It's like the story of the Titanic. You know, it's a great movie, but we all know that the ship sinks. The story of Noah, how many times can we read this study and look for new insights? I mean, everybody knows the story, right? Noah, his woman, his 3 sons and their women, 2 by 2 of all the animals go into the ark. God sends the animals to Noah, and they survive, you know, this massive flood, the waters from above, the water. I mean, we know the basic story, but we want to focus in. We want to take what we think we know, and we want to look at the story afresh. We want to see what is it that's within these texts that stands out. What's going to move us? What's going to help us to understand the way that ancient scribes put this material together? So I said at the outset of this particular series that we're going to talk about some of the theological motifs, some of the things that inspire us and that move us and that connect us with God, the spiritual aspect of these texts. But we're also going to talk about some of the historical, critical, scholarly, academic approaches to the text, because what we want to do is understand the underpinning. We want to understand how this book came together. It's the most remarkable stories in all of history. Now, how did we get these books? What makes these books up? So our story about Noah, according to the book of Genesis, we have to go back. We have to think about a man by the name of Lamech, according to Genesis, and we're not going to get into debating every point on the literal accuracy or the historicity of every single detail. Take a deep breath, relax, and let's work through. Lamech, according to Genesis, at the age of 182, brings forth a son by the name of Noah. And after the birth of this son, Noah, it says that he lives another 595 years after the birth. Now, a lot of people, as you can imagine, from the historicity side, question the longevity that we encounter in some of these antediluvian people, you know, and there have been various proposals put forward. One of the ones that I think I remember hearing even as a young person questioning these ages, which seemed to me to be a bit stretched, was that, well, before the flood, people lived longer. You know, maybe the atmosphere was different and allowed for a longer life or whatever. But whatever someone does with the age, sticking with the text, Lamech at the age of 182 brings forth a son, lives 595 years. His days of his life are recorded as 777 years. Now, it's interesting that 777 associated with Lamech. Now, this Lamech is, that we're talking about, the father of Noah, is the Lamech of the Seth line, which we'll get into. There's another Lamech who's also associated with sevens. Look with me at Genesis 4, and I'm going to use Tabor's translation, Genesis chapter 4 and verse 23. This is a different Lamech, okay? It's from the line of Cain. Genesis 4:23, and Lamech, Cain's Lamech, said to his women, Adah and Zillah, Hear my voice, women of Lamech. Give ear to my saying. Because a man I have killed for my wound, and one brought forth for my stripe. For double sevens avenged is Cain and Lamech 70 and 7. Now, what is the purpose in bringing this up other than, I just want you to notice that we have a Lamech on the Cain side, which is associated with sevens. And then when we get into the Lamech on the Seth line, it's also associated with sevens. He lives 777 years, and then he dies. Now, it's interesting to note, if you study the genealogies and the descendants list on both of these family lines, you're going to notice some similarity between names. I'm not going to go into that. It's beyond the scope of my teaching. But take a look at it. Who are the descendants of Seth? Look at their names. Who are the descendants of Cain? And compare the two. With Seth, we are introduced to a new line in the story. Look at chapter 4 of Genesis, verse 25. Your translation might say, and Adam knew his woman still, or again. The TEB says, and the soil creature knew his woman still, and she brought forth a son, and she called his name Seth. And she called his name Seth. For Elohim has set me another seed instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. And to Seth, to him also was brought forth a son, and he called his name Enosh. Then was a beginning of calling in the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, or Jehovah. Now, at least according to this story, the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is known from the earliest times, all the way into antediluvian times. We've talked about this in another class. Now, if you look at Exodus chapter 6, verse 2 and 3, that text indicates that the name was not known prior to the time of Moses. And this is debated back and forth. Now, I understand the reason that people want to put the name back into the earlier chapters and not find anything suspicious with that. Primarily, these people are apologists, and they're seeking to explain how is it, here's the way they think. If Exodus 6:2 says the name wasn't known prior to the time of Moses, that can't mean what it says, because we find the name prior to that. But there are other explanations, as we've discussed in previous classes. In Genesis 5, there is a section that's not exactly one of our ancient structural divisions, but it's worded closely. Okay? I want you to think about this. If you go to Genesis 5 and verse 1, it doesn't say Ele Toledot like our others, but this one is close. It says, this is the account of the bringings forth of soil creature. Okay? Again, it doesn't say Ele Toledot, but it says Ze Sefer Toledot, which means this is a scroll of bringings forth, or as Tabor more accurately translates it, an account. This is the account of the bringings forth. Now, why is, you would think, well, it's ancient. Maybe it did say, maybe Sefer is scroll. Sefer became what we now call as a scroll, but a Sefer in the most ancient world could be written on a stone cylinder, right? A Megillah is a roll. So a Sefer Megillah is actually more accurately what we would call a scroll. It would be a better translation. Sefer in modern Hebrew means a book, but it's an account. So you see, from modern times back through history, a sefer, and Tabor explains this in a footnote, the word literally means, if you go all the way back, it has to do with accounting. A sofer, a scribe, is one who counts. So it's an account, it's a record, it's from the root to count. So a sefer can be a book, it can be a sefer Megillah, a scroll, or it could be written like on a Babylonian tablet in an ancient script prior to what we now know as Hebrew, right? So what we have, though, is chapter 5. The reason I want to go to chapter 5 is because the language in chapter 5 could be a hint to us that this is another structure within the structure, okay? And I'll explain. The Sefer Toledot of Adam here is out of place. And we're going to focus here first. The language, I believe, hints that this chapter 5, as we now call it, was incorporated by a redactor, someone who is compiling all of these ancient sources, and you'll see why in just a moment. I believe that this source was used in the compilation of the book of Genesis by a later compiler because it brings in some very important information, but it's sort of out of place. Now, I think it existed as a book within the book that ran from chapter 5, verse 1 to chapter 6, verse 8. In other words, whoever compiled Genesis had this sefer. Could have been on a cylinder. It could have been written on a scroll. Don't know. Now, support for my theory is preserved in the ancient triennial cycle of readings. Because in that cycle of readings, one of the readings is Genesis chapter 5:1 through 6:8. That's one book. Now, where did they get the idea for the way that these were broken down? There are indications in the text, generally flagged by white spaces and markings and so forth. So, we have within the ancient triennial cycle, and this, by the way, is where we meet Lamech and Noah. So it's a story. You can't get into the story of Noah and the ark and his descendants without being introduced to Noah. How do we know who is Noah? Well, this ancient Sefer Toledot Adam tells the story. Now, here's something interesting. Scholars don't know what to do with Genesis 5. I want you to think about that for a moment. When scholars have looked at the text of the Pentateuch time and again, and I'm going to be using some of their discoveries, it doesn't mean I accept all of these discoveries, but I want you to be aware of them. You'll be more and more familiar as we work through this. But what is now called the documentary hypothesis, and some people immediately dismiss that and they say, well, there's nothing to that. Hold on, relax, we're going to work through some of these things. But they discovered from an early time in looking at the text, just like we are, that it appears to be comprised of various sources. One of these sources is called J, because it typically, and this is broad definition, don't write this down as you got to define it, but J uses Jehovah from the beginning, uses a divine name from the beginning. So Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, right? That early on. Whereas E, some people think that E uses only Elohim, then that's what they think that's what the scholars are saying. That's not what the scholars are saying. Scholars say that E uses the name Jehovah, but not until Exodus chapter 6, verse 2, right? because it has E, according to the scholarly breakdown, goes before. In other words, they find texts that are E early in Genesis, but that text never uses Jehovah until Exodus 6:2, and then it uses it all the time, right? Or a lot of the time. Well, when scholars look at Genesis 5, here's what they do. They say, you know what? This text doesn't fit neatly into J. It doesn't fit neatly into E. It doesn't fit neatly into P. So guess what they call chapter 5? Other. It's an other source. It's an ancient source in and of itself. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 31, they categorize as other. Now, by the way, I recommend, whether you believe it or accept it or dismiss it totally, to educate yourself and read books like Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, or The Bible with Sources Revealed by Richard Elliott Friedman. Two of the best books I've ever read in my life. I read books all the time that when I'm finished with them and I close them up and put them on the shelf, I don't necessarily have to agree with everything, but it's good to read, so I encourage you to read those. Now, chapter 5, though, is considered by scholars to be an ancient separate source text that focuses on the line of Seth, okay? Now, this line, chapter 5, it's just a pericope. It's a singular ancient source text which gives us 10 generations. It's like a genealogical list. It could have been written on a stone cylinder and passed down. Might have been on an ancient piece of parchment in the land of Egypt. Who knows? But it was by itself. It lists 10 generations. That's all it has in it. It begins with Adam and works its way all the way down. Number 7 in the list is a man by the name of Enoch. You've heard of Enoch, right? The 7th from Adam, I think, is the book of Jude, and the Christian writings call it. And then, now, let's talk about Enoch just for a moment. It's part of this scroll, this source, this ancient other source, chapter 5 of Genesis. And it's bringing us to our main people, Lamech and Noah. So I'm going to touch this. There's not much that we know about Enoch, but that didn't stop creative people in antiquity. When there is a gap, when there is a mystery, people love to fill it. They love to just make things up. Now, a lot of times that is encouraged by the way something is worded. I want you to look with me at Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 and verse 21. This is all we know about Enoch. We read about his birth in chapter 5, verse 18. But let's go down to verse 21. And Enoch lived 65 years and brought forth Methuselah. And Enoch walked about with the Elohim after his bringing forth Methuselah 300 years. And he brought forth sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 65 years and 300 years. And Enoch walked about with the Elohim, and he was not, for Elohim took him. That's it. That's all we have. But that didn't stop creative people. Where is Enoch? It doesn't say he died. If you go back, let me just hit a couple of high points. Chapter 5, verse 5. All the days of Adam, or the soil creature, he lived were 930 years, and he died. Notice, he died. Seth lived, verse 6, 5 years and 100 years, and he brought forth Enosh. And Seth lived, after his bringing forth Enosh, 7 years and 800 years, and he brought forth sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 210 years and 900 years, and he died. Over and over. Enosh brought forth Canaan, verse 11, and he died. And over and over. But you get to Enoch, and it says, and he was not, for God took him. Inquiring minds want to know. Where did he take him? Why does it not say he died? So it comes about that great myth steps in and says, well, let me tell you. I happen to know what happened to Enoch. Enoch was taken to heaven. Very similar to our story of Elijah, right? So people a lot of times will weave these together, Enoch and Elijah, and I'm not saying that that's not true or that that's not a reason to look at this text and go, wow, why is it different? But all we know is, as it says, he was not, for God took him. Now, this source text, the Sefer Toledot Adam, is classified as other, and so verses 1 through 32 of chapter 5 consistently uses Elohim except one verse. So when it refers to the deity, it uses Elohim and not the divine name, with the exception of one verse. I want you to look at verse 28 of chapter 5:28. And it says, and Lamech lived 82 years and 100 years, and he brought forth a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, this one will console us from our doing and from the distress of our hands from the soil that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh has cursed. That's the only appearance of the divine name, and it's in a text which is explaining the meaning of the name Lamech. Now, this is interesting. Aside from the fact that it's the only text, the only verse in our other categorized other text of chapter 5, which gives us a meaning for a name. In other words, we meet with Adam in chapter, no, doesn't tell us why his name means what, or what his name means. And you work your way down. Seth, we don't get all the way through. Now, what I want to draw out is that the last name that has been explained to us is Seth in chapter 4 and verse 25 and 26. The scholars believe that these explanatory notes are the work of the final compiler, the person who's weaving these texts together. So this is what the academics believe generally, that in the ancient world, the original composer doesn't feel the need to explain things in such detail. You would know. I know who this person, I know that, but a later person is coming in and said, let me explain to you. Why is he called that? Because this is what they believe. Now, if there is anything to the idea that there is a final compiler or redactor, let me say this. If that's true, maybe it's not, but if it's true, I believe that this person, whoever pulled these stories together, is at least brilliant and a genius. More likely, that person is inspired. So anyone who might believe that I'm some liberal academic type who doesn't relate to these texts as somehow being somewhat special, you have me wrong. Because I believe that there is what I would call divine redaction, where someone is greatly inspired and aided and guided to pull these stories together. Because they're working with material that they've inherited from antiquity, right? So I want to stress that. I think it's very important that we not dismiss this as simply, there's nothing to these stories. I think the redactor is the key to pulling this together. Now, who is the redactor? We're going to get into this question as we work through. Maybe there's some clues. Is it a man? Is it a woman? Is it Moses? Is it Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah? All of those questions will come as we work through. But in chapter 5 and verse 29, we are to understand that this son of Lamech is to bring comfort or consolation. This person, Noah, is to usher in a remedy to a curse on the ground. In other words, the ground is cursed for a certain period of time, And this son of Lamech, call him Ben Lamech, Noah ben Lamech. When Lamech has Noah, Noah is to bring consolation for a place, the ground, which has been cursed. And that curse goes all the way back to the earliest chapters of Genesis. Go with me this morning to Genesis chapter 3. I want to show you something that a lot of the scholars don't bring up. But James Tabor's translation brings this out. So Genesis chapter 3, and I want to read verse 17. Chapter 3, verse 17. And it says, "And to soil creature he said, because you hearkened to the voice of your woman, and you ate from the tree that I charged you, saying, you will not eat from it, cursed is the soil on account of you, in distress." Everybody to yourself say distress. "In distress you will eat it all the days of your life." Okay, so we have a curse placed on the ground because the soil creature and his woman have committed an offense. They did that which they were commanded not to do. And because of that, there is going to be a curse on the ground which yields distress to the man. Now, notice verse 16. Let's go back one. "Toward the woman, he said, making abundant, I will surely make abundant your distress." Now, everybody to yourself say distress. "And your pregnancy in distress, you will bring forth sons, and toward your man will be your craving, and he will rule in you." Now, the reason I wanted to highlight that is because the writer in chapter 5 of an unknown source, remember the scholars say we don't put this as J or E or P, we don't know what to do with it, it's other. What I'm about to show you is something that I've not seen in an academic source. In chapter 5, there's an interesting thing. It connects in chapter 5 the curse that we meet in chapter 3, and it brings it together. So let me make this clear. This is called an inclusio. Imagine brackets. You take a long document and you say, I'm going to bracket from the time the curse comes in until there's mention of the curse again. That puts it, even though they're separate sources, you see the thread that runs through. All right? Now, all this is going to tie together. Stick with me. So, in distress is going to help us put the connection on this inclusio. We're going to see a time of distress, the curse on the land. So, the judgment brings what in Hebrew is called atzav. Atzav is translated distress. I can't hear you because I'm talking and you guys don't say anything, but what does your translation say about the translation of itzav? Atzav is the root word. Does it say pain? Does it say agony? What is your But notice Tabor's translation says distress, distress, distress. You know why it does that? Because it's the same Hebrew word. Why use a different Hebrew word? If I want to read the Bible, I want transparency. It's the whole reason I studied Hebrew. I don't know if I trust King James. I don't know if I trust the New International Committee. I want to know what the Hebrew says. This helps you do that, right? So I want to know, what does atzav mean? Tabor says it means distress. Is he right? Yes. It can mean physical pain. It can mean emotional distress, hardship, and even sorrow. But the underlying meaning, you see, is distress. So the ground is going to be, it's not going to be easy anymore. You're going to get bread, but it's the sweat of your brow. It's going to be distress. A woman, you're going to have children, but it's going to be, distressing. Okay. Through accurate translation or studying from the words in connection with the words and on the basis of the words, what I'm now noticing is sections of text which are connected, whether they be identified by scholars as J or E or P. What am I saying? We're now looking at the same text that minds before us have looked at and come up with some good ideas. But have they missed an underlying connecting thread? Is it so easy to take the Bible and say, oh, that's J, this is E, this is... The answer is no. There's a guiding hand here, and I believe this, that connects these stories. So by accuracy of translation, what you have is a connecting of a story in Genesis 3, which is classified by scholars as J, and you're going to see it connect to other texts which are from a different source, supposedly. How did that happen? Okay. Noah is considered, his name means to console or comfort. The Comforter. When the Comforter comes, he's going to bring about a reversal of the curse. Relief. Relief from the distress. In Lamech, when he names him, he says, this son of mine will be a consoler who will console us from our doing, mima'asenu, from our doing, and from the distress, me'itzavon, of our hands from the soil that Jehovah has cursed. All right, now go to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 6. And let's see, it says in 6 verse 6, and Jehovah was sorry that he had made the soil creature on the land, and it made distress toward his heart. Okay, now this is interesting, because in Genesis 6:6 says that Jehovah is sorry. Now that word is interesting because this verse is interesting because it has three things that stand out to me. Number one, Jehovah is sorry that he made man, and it caused distress. Those three words, the Hebrew behind that, tie back to chapter 5 and verse 29, which is considered by scholars to be a whole nother source. Now, how did that happen? Maybe it's not so easy to separate these sources out. Maybe people have not paid attention to the ancient structure that the book... Look, the people who discovered these, identified these sources, are people like me and you who study Scripture. What if they're not correct on every point? Now, the interesting thing is this. Whenever you look at the word for Noach, the word Noach, and where he's going to bring consolation, nun chet, nun kaf. All right? No, I'm sorry. I was right the first time. Nun chet. I'm looking at another word in my head. Noach, nun chet. And a comforting one is tied to that. So where it says that Noach is one who consoles and Jehovah is one who is sorry, it's the same root word. Where it says that this child Noah is going to relieve us from the work, the toil, that word is asa, to do or to make. And where it says Jehovah was sorry that he made man, same word. And then where it says that Noah is going to bring about relief from the distress, itzavon, where it says that God is distressed in his heart, same word. My point being that underneath the English, which is often translated variously, we have to recognize that the remedy that Noah brings is the very thing that God needs remedied. He's sorry that he made man. He's sorry that he made man, and it grieved him at his heart. So what does he do? Noah comes along. Noah brings consolation to the sorrow, right? He gives relief to the toil of our hands, which ties with us. It's perfect every way through. So what I'm saying is that what scholars call J or the redactor, they often harmonize if you look deep enough. There's a connecting thread that indicates a genius unparalleled in the history of history. The history of history. Unparalleled. No document does this. Now, the artistry of the Bible resists easily being torn apart and placed neatly into sources. Because beyond these sources is a thread that weaves like a tapestry, a beauty that's unparalleled. Now, our story of Noah, the bad on the ground increases until there's only one remedy. The remedy is to wipe man out, to wipe it clean and start over. There's nothing else you can do. It's rotten to the core. The whole thing, you got to scrap the plan. Because the bad of man. Last week, one of the things that we read was that Noah, as Genesis, as the first annual cycle reading concludes, it says, and Noah found favor in the eyes of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Found favor. Often translated grace. There's even an artistry in that, because the word Noah, if you reverse the letters, it spells chen. Chen is Noah in reverse, and people who look at the Hebrew recognize the artistry even there. Noah is shown chen. It's an artistry and a beauty. And then we get into Ele Toledot Noach, covers from Noah until his death in chapter 9 and verse 28. We know the main components of the story, total destruction except for Noah and his family, his woman, his 3 sons, their wives, and the animals. We read that Noah, look at chapter 6, verse 9, Noah was a just man. He was whole in his life cycles. And with Elohim, the Elohim, Noah walked about. Noah is an ish tzaddik, a righteous man. Or Tabor says a just man. And further we learn that he's tamim, which can mean blameless, whole, complete, without basically a sense of soundness, without flaw in his generations. And it says he walked about with the God. Now again, remember in Genesis 5, we read that about Enoch. He walked about with God. Same thing is said of Noah. This becomes a calling card for what identifies someone who's in the right in the sight of God. They walk with God. It's a journey. Faith is a journey. And the biblical literature is certain to make that point throughout. But this is what sets Noah and Enoch and other godly people apart from their generation, is that the vast majority do not fall within that category, right? In fact, in chapter 6, verse 5 of Genesis, it says that every shaping of the thoughts of his heart was only bad all the days. Every thought, even the shaping of the thoughts was on bad all the days. Now, what else is going on in this story? Strange, strange story. The sons of Elohim see the daughters of men, or the daughters of Adam, and it says they took to themselves women from all that they chose. There's much debate over this. People debate, who are the B'nai Elohim? Are the B'nai Elohim angels or angelic beings? Are they, literally it means the sons of the Elohim. Now, some people who try to avoid this strangeness say, well, the sons of Elohim are the sons of Seth and the daughters of men. Well, let me tell you what, that is not the way it was viewed in antiquity. It is a very strange story. And we know from other ancient peoples the stories of the gods or the demigods or the divine beings having sex with human women and producing, we know this story is very much a part of the ancient world. And so this story is similar, and it's in the Hebrew Bible. And people can say, well, I don't believe that. Well, I'm just telling you, it's part of our literature. We have to think about it. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this episode in Genesis chapter 6 about the sons of B'nai Elohim and the daughters of men, and they created through their intercourse giants or men of the name, right? Well, whoever the B'nai Elohim are, what we find is that the mixing of the two, the sons of Elohim and the daughters of Adam, that's a bridge too far. That's the last straw. That leads to the whole thing's got to be, we have to start over. All right? Everybody take a deep breath. The winter of 1946-47, three Bedouin were on the western side of the Dead Sea. One picks up a rock, throws it into a cave, into a small opening in the marled cliffs at a place called Khirbet Qumran, and he hears a crash. The story is rather detailed, but I'll just say that when a couple of days later, for reasons that are covered in my book, by the way, and any book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they do go to investigate and pull out their findings, one of the things that was discovered was a scroll that we now refer to as the Genesis Apocryphon. And in the Genesis Apocryphon, Lamech, who is Noah's daddy, is a little bit troubled. Now, he's greatly troubled. Why is he troubled? According to this ancient scroll, he's troubled because his wife is pregnant and he wants to know if the baby is his. Now, you can relate. This would be troubling. He thinks that if the baby is not his, it might be the seed of a watcher, the fallen angels or whatever. So read the Genesis Apocryphon. Now, he's concerned that the child his wife is pregnant with the child of a watcher or a holy one, and his wife is at great pains to convince him that the baby in her womb is his. She tells him, dear, I'm paraphrasing, but she says, honey, you remember the pleasure that, she's like, no, it's yours. She says, matter of factly, this is your seed. The fruit was planted by you. She wants him to understand this is his baby. Now, he still has his doubts. Evidently, this was a pretty common thing in this area at this time, according to the scroll. Get it? I'm just not saying the scroll is recording accurate history. This is an ancient document, though. And so Lamech runs to his dad, and he talks to his dad, and then he has his dad go find Enoch. Remember, God took Enoch, but he's got a hunt. So it's like a journey to go find the truth. Now, the whole reason I bring that up is because it ties an ancient scroll that is separate from the biblical account with the story that we're talking about in the early chapters of Genesis. Now, interestingly enough, Noah's mama has a name given in this scroll. You know what her name is? Bat-Enosh. You know what that means? The daughter of a mortal. A mortal. So it was such a problem, according to this scroll, that in ancient times these watchers or holy ones are taking women for themselves and making them pregnant, that for a child to be, you want your baby, my baby's pure. My baby's a daughter of a mortal, right? So her name is Bat-Enosh. We don't get that in the biblical account. Now, for people who say, well, Ross, that's a strange story. Well, Genesis 6 is a strange story. We're talking about ancient text and the ability to tell a story in the ancient world. So we have to look at the text and we have to say, does this give us historical data? Is it the recollection of an epic? Is it embellished? We'll have to look at those things as we work our way through. There are other ancient stories that exist about a universal flood, if you will. So we have a Sumerian account where the hero is not called Noah. In the Sumerian account, it's Ziusudra. And Ziusudra means the life of prolonged days. So this Ziusudra of the Sumerian account extends the days of man, basically. And you can read that account. You can Google it and look it up. I'm not going to go there today. There's also an Akkadian account where the hero is called, not Ziusudra, not called Noah, but he's called Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim, his story is contained in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the ancient world is telling these stories. In my opinion, the Hebrew Bible and the biblical narrative stands apart and above all these other stories. If you think that the biblical story is a bit strange, read these others, right? Noah, our hero, is a just and righteous man who has shown favor by God. He's selected to usher in a new beginning. During the deluge narrative, he never speaks. A lot of people don't notice that. During the entire flood, never says a word. And God spoke unto Noah, and Noah did it. And God said, do this, and Noah did it. A narrator's telling us this. It never says that Noah said, how big's this thing got to be? There's no dialogue recorded. In fact, the only words that Noah speaks in the Bible are recorded for us at the end of Ele Toledot Noah, right before he dies. And remember, he gets drunk and passes out in his tent, and this, whatever happens, and he pronounces a curse and a blessing. Cursed be Canaan, he says, and blessed be Shem and the tents of Japheth. It's only 2 verses. Genesis chapter 9, verse 25 and 27. That's all that is recorded of the words of Noah. Clearly, afterwards, Noah has 3 sons, and the son where our focus is now directed becomes Shem. And so as to the story of the flood, though, let me put a couple of points together for you. It does appear that within the main structure, the redactor pulls together these sources for, in the final compilation, and people, I wish they wouldn't miss this, but they miss the 10 sections within Genesis. The artistry is beautiful. The final redactor pulls these 10 together, and within these 10, he compiles it from various ancient sources. The story of Noah and his sons also contains different ancient sources that he had at his disposal. I'll give you an example. If you look at, let me just show you, look at Genesis 6. I'm going to show you how this is weaved together. I think this is beautiful. Genesis chapter 6, verse 19 and 20. And from every living thing of all flesh, two of all, you will make come toward the vessel to make them live with you. A male and a female they will be. From the flyer, according to its type, and from the animal according to its type, and from every moving thing of the soil according to its type, two from all will come toward you to make them live. Look down at chapter 7, verse 8. From clean animal, and from the animal that is not clean, and from the flyer and everything that moves about upon the soil, two by two, they came toward Noah, toward the vessel, male and female, as Elohim charged Noah. Look down at verse 15. And they came toward Noah, toward the vessel, two by two from all flesh. Now these verses indicate that whether clean or unclean, which by the way, we don't even know what clean and unclean means at this point, not in the biblical narrative. But let me just stick with me here. These verses indicate that it's two by two. You got to clean. What we got here, Noah? These are clean animals. Okay, well, give me two of them, male and a female. What about these? These are pig, Noah. We don't need, I need two of them too. Right? Two by two, everything. Clean, unclean, doesn't matter. But there's another source. Look at chapter 7, verse 2. From all the clean animals, you will take for yourself 7 by 7, a man and his woman. Well, that's interesting reading. It uses a different Hebrew there. The one that says 2 by 2 always says a male and his female. But in this one that mentions the 7 by 7, it says a man and his woman. And from the animal that is not clean, it will be 2, a man and his woman. Also, from the flyer of the sky, 7 by 7, a male and a female, to let seed live upon the land, because it goes on. Now, again, the writer, the final redactor, has a couple of different stories. Now, I am grateful that they're all compiled and that there's a connection, there's a weaving together. I like the complexity of the text. I like the fact that it makes us think, why does it say that here and say this there? All of it, at least the ones that we have as part of our Bible today, were preserved. And it allows us, we have to wrestle with these things though. Now, this is all going to make sense as we work through and you begin to become familiar with what the academics call this source or that source. So for instance, a lot of times people have a very limited understanding of JEPD, the documentary hypothesis. And so they say, well, if it has to do with sacrifices, it's P, it's priestly. That's not true. It's not true. P does have sacrifices, but you know what? P never has a sacrifice until Exodus chapter 40. Why? Because you have to have the tabernacle if you're a priest. So there are priestly passages, plenty of priestly passages before Exodus chapter 40. But you know what none of those contain? Ne'er mention of sacrifice. Only at Exodus 40. So but this stuff will make more sense. Okay, now Noah represents a new beginning, a starting over. He is a comforter, the comforter who will come, who is to console us from our work or our doing, from the distress of our hands, from the soil that Jehovah has cursed. He was shown favor. He simply did as he was commanded. Let me tell you, Noah is all action and no words. One thing that we never see is that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. That comes in later in Christian writings and Muslim writings, Arabic stories, and Jewish, commentaries and midrashim. All these stories people add to. Noah didn't say a word. He's not presented as a preacher of righteousness, but rather as a doer of justice in a world of rebellion, injustice, and violence. Noah, ish tzaddik bedorotav. And he walked with God. Noah is a righteous man, a just man in his generation. Around him is wickedness that has reached to high heaven. My grandmother used to say that all the time. That stinks to high heaven. I miss old Granny. He was whole. Like Enoch, he walked with God. Because of his righteousness, his justice in an unjust world, he saved himself and his family. Now, Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14 and 20 says, listen, God is speaking according to Ezekiel 14, verse 14 and verse 20, and he says, if Noah, Daniel and Job, but he says, Noah, one of the three, if Noah stood before me now, if this generation had Noah in it, Noah would only save himself. That's how bad it got. Makes me wonder, what would the saying be today? What would it be today? If Noah was in this generation, would he save himself? Would he save his family? What would God say? Look, we have a task. When we look at these people, whether a person believes in the historicity of every point of the story, but here's the idea, the underlying idea is, are we being ish tzaddik in our generation? And what does that mean? Noah ushered in a new world, a new bringings forth. Focus not on all the sons of Noah. The focus is narrowed going forward, but on one line, one family, a family that brings us from Shem through Terach to Avram. And our final compiler, the genius, man or woman, I'm not sure yet, whoever it was that compiled these texts was at least a genius and brilliant, quite possibly inspired and guided to pull all of these texts together. With Noah and his sons, the Elohim makes a covenant. And we're going to meet with covenant from this point forward, not before. People talk about there's covenant before. It's not. Covenant is beginning with Noah. And there's a reason. Beginning next week, we're going to open the book to the next division according to the ancient compiler. And we're going to talk about the next book brings us into the story of the bringings forth of Terach. And through Terach, we meet the friend of God. Don't miss next week. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Thanks for joining us.